Good day, everybody. It's a warm welcome from the Asia-Europe People's Forum. And it's a warm welcome to what we believe is a timely and important webinar with the ambitious but important title, Knowledge as Commons, towards inclusive science and technology. Quite clearly, there are at least two dimensions to this discussion. How science, technology, and information are currently developed and controlled, including against the interests of the majority people. And secondly, legal processes and the so-called rule of law, inverted commas, that is increasingly been, as some people call it, weaponized, and what is leading to what has been described recently as a general atmosphere of intimidation under the shadow of draconian laws. My name is Andy Rutherford. I'm here moderating on behalf of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. I'm a member of the International Organizing Committee. We have the privilege of three speakers today, Vijay, Dorothy, and Achin, and we are asking each speaker to make an initial contribution of, let's say, no more than 15 minutes. We will then have time for questions. If you would like to intimate, to share any potential questions, you have the opportunity to do so in the chat, which is got to focus on questions today. Okay, so thank you all for joining the webinar from across the world. And now I'd like to move to our first speaker, Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist, and much more, of course. And he is the author of at least 40 books. Vijay is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he is the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, the chief editor of Leftword Books in Delhi, and also he has appeared in 2 films. So a warm welcome, Vijay. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you for your contribution.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andy. The title of today's webinar is actually drawn from a book written by Prabir Purkayastha called Knowledge as Commons. And I'm starting there because, of course, Prabir has been in prison for now almost 6 months, just a few days to go for the 6-month anniversary of his incarceration. About 22 years ago, Prabir and I wrote a book together about Enron Corporation and its entry into India, its violation of Indian sovereignty and the needs of the Indian people in terms of energy and so on. I decided I'll hold up all the books that Leftword has published by Prabir. It's a considerable archive, and it brings me joy to hold them and show them to you, because it's with great love and care that we made these books, many of them together. One of the interesting aspects of the accusation against Prabir is that he is somehow part of an attempt to destabilize India, which is entirely ironic because from the very first piece of writing that Prabir has done, which is some of it collected in Knowledge as Commons, from the very earliest writings, Prabir has been a great defender of both the Indian project and of the Indian people, fighting for the democratization of science, the democratization of society, and so on. A very opposite of the kind of charge brought by the Indian government. I mean, I can't think of a person more committed to the Indian people than somebody like Prabir. I mean, the very idea that he is a destabilizer is for me bizarre, because this is somebody who has believed and continues to believe in the advancement of the possibilities of the Indian people. But it isn't impossible that that somebody like Prabir would get accused in the way he is accused. And in my 15 minutes, I want to make two interventions. One is about the nature of the changes taking place in the world, and how in these changes, in this churning of the world order, people like people like us, in fact, because we are all in a sense complicit in the same kind of politics, people like us are caught up in this great churning. So I want to spend a little time on this great churning and the implications for science and technology. And then I want to talk a little bit about this idea of science, technology, and democratization. So that's really what I want to do. These are, it seems to me, core issues, meaningful issues for my friend, my teacher, my comrade Probir Purkayastha. Well, on the first point, many years ago, Samir Amin made a very interesting reflection. Samir argued that imperialism has 5 different arenas of social life that it seeks to control. And having mastered these 5 areas of social life, its tentacles are pretty deep into the soil of global society. So let me just go over the 5 controls, as Samir called them. The first control was control over resources. It's pretty straightforward. You want to have control over the most important resources on the planet, not only energy, but also resources to produce the major commodities that basically enable capitalist accumulation to go on endlessly, whether it's textiles at a certain point, or the raw materials for plastics, or now the various raw materials for electronic goods. So number one, control over raw materials. And interestingly, over the course of the last 20 years, control over raw materials by particularly the global north countries hasn't been as effective as it used to be. Other countries are challenging the global north in terms of control over raw materials. And it's not just China that's mounting this challenge, it's other large countries of the global south, whether they are able to get raw materials from other countries, or whether they're able to protect their own raw materials. In other words, have sovereignty over their own raw materials. This is countries like Indonesia, Brazil, the Sahel states in Africa now, with the military coups saying we're not going to just allow our uranium to get deposited in France. We're going to exercise sovereignty over our raw materials. Chile and the question of lithium, how the lithium should be allowed to be transmitted to countries around the world, and so on. So the first control is control over raw material. And where once it was in the hands of the old colonial powers, now it's largely contested. The second control in Samir's equation was control over finance. And certainly after the end of colonialism, with the major financial resources in, at the time, what was considered the Western countries, they dominated financial systems. In fact, they created the financial systems, whether it's the SWIFT network to transfer money across boundaries, or in fact, the bondholders in the wealthy countries lending money through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But now financial systems are not so carefully controlled by the global north countries. Again, there is the arrival of other major powers in the world offering finance at concessionary rates, whether this is, for instance, the New Development Bank or the BRICS Bank, which offers concessionary financing, sometimes at rates much better than the World Bank. So in the arena of finance, control over finance no longer as absolute as it was in an earlier period. The third arena is in communications. Now that's interesting, because in communications, the old colonial powers, in fact, set up all the communication systems. People may not know, but Reuters, the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, these have all very deep colonial histories. They were set up effectively as colonial news services. And in fact, they continue in that way, including BBC, later the creation of CNN much later, but with a very colonial worldview in terms of how they report events around the world. Now, in terms of communication, and I'm going to come back to this toward the end, there is less of a contest. The McBride report from 1980, the UN report which tried to democratize international communications, basically sits on its shelf from 1980 onward. It's an excellent report on international communications, but there was really no democratization of international communications, no real contest. The fourth area of control was control over weapons systems. You'll remember at one point the Indian government, using the slogan "Make in India," suggested that India was going to make arms. Well, didn't really do a very good job of it. Continued to import arms from the French and others, or the Rafale jet fighter from the Russians, from the United States, from the Israelis, other countries. Weapon systems largely dominated by Western countries. So there is no contest. The fifth control was control over science and technology. This is, of course, very close to Probir's own work. Control over science and technology is an interesting arena because until about 20 years ago, through the intellectual property regime that had been put in place at the World Trade Organization, Western countries, Western multinational corporations dominated science and technology. But then, through the contradictions of globalization, by outsourcing industrialization, by opening up, showing what the science was in certain things like in solar paneling, in iPhones and so on, by having to turn over certain kinds of technologies and science, we began to see other countries develop their own scientific and technological capabilities. Now, in India, the story is interesting, and Probir tells that story in Knowledge as Commons. Part of the whole process of building the republic, the nation state after independence, was to build up India's own science and technological infrastructure, whether it's the intellectual side of it through the universities, through the side of building industry and so on. India was able to generate its own science and technology. Some of that squandered during the liberalization period. And in fact, that's where a large part of the contest occurs between the squandering of that independence of science and technology, not independence in terms of autarky, being somehow separate from the rest of the world, but building one's own capacity to generate science and technology, to generate the goods and services needed by people as they live in a modern democracy. So, interestingly, in this fifth arena, there is a great contest in the world over science and technology as many powers around the world are developing their own forms of scientific breakthroughs, whether it's high-speed rail or robotics or in the new internet of all things and so on. Many countries are having developments. They are not all reliant upon the global North powers. India here has not had as many breakthroughs as perhaps it should have, given its history of having developed its own autonomous science and technological establishment after independence. But nonetheless, there have been some kinds of developments of its own. It's not entirely subordinated. So there is a churning of the world order going on now. And it's in this churning that the global North countries have found it very difficult to maintain control over the system that they used to dominate. They're finding it very difficult to maintain control. And having the lack of an ability to maintain control, they exercise power in the two axes, the two controls that they continue to dominate. And that's communications and that's weapon systems. Hence, the kind of decadent wars that they have been prosecuting, whether it's that NATO war in Ukraine, it's trying to draw China into a war, which is insane. And then it's the barbaric murder of the Palestinian people in Gaza, a weapon system substituting for any other form of human interaction. That's one. And secondly, communications. And here we come back to the question of Probir Purkayastha, NewsClick, and so on. Rather than have the debate and the dialogue and the discussion about what kind of country to have, rather than have a debate and dialogue about, let's say, the situation of farmers in India, or have a dialogue about whether science should be democratized further, the role of rationality in a modern society, rather than have that dialogue, that conversation, communication systems are used to basically defame people, to cut them down, to make accusations that are far-fetched, and then to use those kind of accusations to go one step further, which is to criminalize forms of dissent, to criminalize forms of thought. And that's precisely what happened to Probir Purkayastha. He has been criminalized for having a conversation. What should be the nature of the Indian Republic? What should be the status of science and technology in India? Should science not be something merely instrumentalized for industry, but something that is part of the arsenal of creating a deeper democracy in society? Should science be about rationalizing social interactions and so on? That's a conversation. That's a pretty fair conversation that any modern society should have. But because of the churning of the world order, the loss of control by Western countries, because of that, there's a kind of a reflexive use of the few instruments they have left, particularly communications. And, all of this
A
would
couple
have
more
been,
minutes, Vijay,
all of
please.
this would have been meaningless to Probir's life had the New York Times not decided to basically publish the most scurrilous stories about him, which included him, not about him, which included him, scurrilous stories. Those scurrilous stories picked up by the Indian government, and then we are where we are. The ability or desire to have a conversation about the nature of society should not, of course, be criminalized. It should be welcomed. Part of the process of democratization in general is to have, not only allow, but to have that conversation about the role of ingenuity to make social life richer, better, more habitual for people, more something that people will find, that makes their own interactions, less toxic, more loving. That's the nature of that conversation. And to prevent that conversation seems to me the greater crime than to criminalize the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. That is impeccable. That's great for timing, but also for setting a powerful overview of the context for our discussion today. And of course, giving the brilliant context for Probir's latest book, which is a summary of his great thought around knowledge as commons, which in itself is just such a wonderful, powerful title, which we need to, or we could almost have a webinar just on the title itself, which is so important. And also for you, for highlighting, Vijay, the simple fact that Probir is being criminalized for initiating, in this case, a conversation. This is a new, I won't say a low, but a new extreme that has been reached here. And so I think, thank you very much for that very powerful, very clear context for our discussions today. We'll come back to many of the points you raised in our questions and discussion later on. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce our second contributor, Dorothy Guerrero. Dottie has worked with social movements and NGOs for over 30 years. She's originally from the Philippines and has lived in Netherlands, Germany, Thailand, South Africa before moving now to the UK. She previously worked with the Transnational Institute, the African Women Unite Against Destructive Resource Extraction, Focus on the Global South, Achin House, Deutschland, and the Institute for Popular Democracy in the Philippines. Dottie is head of policy and advocacy with Global Justice Now, based in the UK. She is currently works on and writes about corporate accountability, climate change, migration, trade and investment, China, and other related economic justice concerns. Dottie, the floor is yours, and a very, very warm welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That now reminded me to shorten my my intro in our website. Well, I thank Vijay for his presentation, because I will also use that same framework in my discussion. I would like to discuss how knowledge is used to keep the status quo, also to repress and use to protect or support vested interests. However, alternative use of knowledge will be used or held as commons. It could be emancipatory. So what are the hindrances for using knowledge for emancipation? So I think that would be an important question for us all, especially those that are not just from social movement, but also those that are trying to speak to power, and also, of course, to journalists and those that are trying to use information to build that caring society that Vijay, caring and loving society that Vijay mentioned. I think one important thing happening now, or this year, actually is a historic year for elections. We are facing the biggest election year in history, and that globally more than 2 billion voters will have gone or will go to the polls in 50 countries. So apart from the UK, which we don't know yet when the election will be, of course, neighboring countries across the channel, there will be an EU election in June, and also the US, India, and Mexico, among others, are people there will choose the new government and their new leaders. An election offers a huge possibility for change in leadership, and hence the potential to change immediate and future conditions. However, we also know that elections and election campaigning is different now, that it's not just parties presenting their visions. Information and knowledge is also used to suppress those information, and at the same time to control the outcome of elections. So that is not seen not just in the North, but also increasingly in the global South. And that reminded me of the election results, or also the conduct of election, wherein candidates were rebuilt or rehabilitated through the use of social media. And the sad fact is that democracy relies on the public agreeing on the body of reliable knowledge and information. If you don't have that, so these two aspects of shared knowledge, wherein you need to build confidence in the process by which power is distributed, foremost among them is in the election process. If that is no longer to be believed, then we are really in trouble. Also, secondly, reliable information about the evidence in support of different policy options. This aspect is also being eroded by the widespread dissemination or of misinformation, or we can also say this is already malinformation. So this information threatens democracy, especially now that in choosing leaders and also upholding the results of elections as well. As we all know what happened in the US when Trump tried to rally supporters on that fateful January 6th, and people tried to overturn election results. So this information is closing down democratic space. Also, very recently, now that we are told we are emerging out of the COVID pandemic, we have seen that how knowledge is also suppressed In the early stage, when the information on the initial number of COVID cases in Wuhan province were actually reportedly far greater than disclosed, when that information was suppressed by the Chinese government, the possibility of curving the spread of COVID-19 early on was also hindered. Without that censorship imposed by Beijing, the Chinese media would have informed the public about the seriousness of the threat or to health much sooner and could have spared thousands of lives and possibly avoiding the pandemic. However, at the height of the pandemic as well, so that's the early part. At the height of the pandemic, the patents on life-saving medicines controlled by the global north gave vaccine producers exclusive control over the vaccines to which they own the intellectual property rights. So it became an issue of life and death wherein transnational corporations controlled the outcome of who will live or die. But the question is also, have governments learned from the lessons of the pandemic, and are they ready to apply those now that they are negotiating a new global pandemic agreement that will govern how future pandemics will be addressed? It looked like clearly not. I'm following the negotiation on that pandemic agreement, and until now, after 2 years of talks, there are still bottlenecks on key issues in the negotiation, to the point that they have, like in the loss and damage, I was very reminded of this, that they have now decided there will be an additional meeting this April, because there are still bottlenecks on how key issues in the negotiation on the pandemic agreement, how low-income countries are not getting assurance on technology transfer and access on whatever vaccine will be produced when a new pandemic will break out, on emerging pathogens, better prevention, and monitoring of disease outbreaks and financing, etc. All these bottlenecks, the global north is not budging from their very strong position that they don't want to share because they are protecting supposedly innovation. And the problem is that justifying extension of intellectual property privileges, at the moment it is 20 years or more. They say that this incentivizes research. However, it doesn't really fit the reality that when intellectual property rules have got tighter and more enforceable, innovation actually plummets. And in most breakthroughs in medicines today or vaccines, many of them are through public sector funding. And that information is also not shared enough. And the work of university departments and small biotech companies, public sector funding is usually most important at the riskiest stage of development. However, when vaccines or medicines are produced, then it will be handed on a silver platter to big pharmaceutical corporations so they continue their control. And now we see that when seemingly more effective mRNA of vaccines were sold overwhelmingly to the richest part of the world, the majority continued to be left without. And that is deciding over who will live or die. In the 19th century, Friedrich Engels coined the phrase mass murder, a social policy, to describe the conditions created by the capitalist class in England that inevitably led to premature and natural death, especially among the poorest classes. It seems that today, global elites have willfully created the same condition, again in this century. The inefficiency of many governments in addressing a health emergency and ensuring everyone has access to life-saving vaccines contributed to the global pandemic and to the death of millions, or what we call now as preventable death. And that is also because there is still a prevalent belief among politicians in market fundamentalism, or that the market should have primacy over people's health and even human rights. Patents on life-saving vaccines and medicine prevents us as a society actually from being able to publicly create the medicines we will need in the future, and at a price that we can afford. So that is on the global pandemics, but also an equally huge threat to our existence is also the climate change. And we know that fossil fuel corporations since the 1950s actually know how the production of fossil fuels, the extraction of those energy materials impact the climate. And despite that knowledge, instead of sharing that knowledge, they funded denialism. But now that they have lost on the debate, and that there is now a global consensus that climate change is driving current environmental and ecological breakdown, they are now resorting, or after they've done this in more than 20 years, they are now presenting themselves as part of the solutions, even if they are hindering the solutions to be implemented. So most of the corporations, apart from, of course, instead of paying for pollution, they are instead continuing to make their stockholders millionaires. And the knowledge of their role on climate change is still being washed away through greenwashing, through the partnership with UN, and also in the new trend towards more stakeholderism instead of multilateralism, so that now corporations are invited as experts, those with expert knowledge towards problem solving, to the detriment of the global south actually sitting and deciding. So it is now a threat that we are facing us all in the future implementation of the UN reform. But I will maybe this is too early to talk about that. However, many campaigners are now worried of that situation or when that happens. So if we see suppressing knowledge is also suppressing the possibility of dissent, the possibility of emancipation. So how knowledge is misused, and also not just against dissent, but most importantly now against journalists to hide the truth and prevent that truth from spreading is the highest attack on democracy. And we really need to also organize against this. So the question, how do we organize in a way that it is beyond campaigns? How do we organize so that more people can speak truth to power is very, very important at this point in our history. How that power also for our movements to change the power relations in society is very, very more important. So I think I will stop there. I don't know if I have already reached the 15 minutes, but I will look forward to the discussions. But since you're not warning me, Andy, I think I'm still within time, so I will just stop.
You're still in time, yeah.
Well, it's okay. I'll just, I'm not looking. Oh, no, it's no wait, it's fine.
Okay, Dottie, thank you so much indeed. Thank you very much for that contribution, and especially for highlighting spotlighting the linkages, the contemporary linkages, not just in the pandemic, but in other areas between communication and the restricted communication by states and by institutions, and the relationship that has on science and technology and people's access to it in a fundamental way. Okay, thank you very much. Our last speaker, it's a privilege to introduce Achin Vanaik. He was the assistant editor with the Times of India from 1978 to 1990, sat on the executive board of Greenpeace India for many years, was a member of the Ghosh Committee, set up independently to evaluate India's national literary mission, 1993 to 1994. Achin is a retired professor of international relations and former head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi, and a lifelong activist for nuclear disarmament, amongst many other things. Achin has authored, edited, and contributed to many books. And Achin is also a TNI Fellow and Associate. Achin, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Vijay and Dottie. We're all gathered here in a certain sense to express our solidarity with Prabir, who has been shamefully and unjustifiably incarcerated for being what he is, and that is an intellectual activist committed to the pursuit of social justice and democracy. I'm going to focus on the book. I read the book, and I urge everybody to get the book. It's a very important book. And of course, different readers will be affected in different ways. What I want to do is I want to summarize what was, I think, some of the most important aspects or parts of this book. And I'm focusing on 3 dimensions, which I'll take turn by turn. The first dimension. Prabir has thought deeply about how science and technology are both strongly related and different in respect of their goals and objectives. Science is about the discovery of how nature behaves, operates. That is to say, it's about the discovery of the laws of nature so as to better explain and predict. Technology, Prabir emphasizes this, technology is about making things with a specific function that work reliably, economically, and safely, while addressing the social needs, demands, and purposes that have motivated their production. This is very important, of course. Technology, as Prabir points out, changes the human world and the way humans relate to nature, but it does not change the laws of nature itself. A question: do scientific discoveries always come first, and then technology as the mere application of science? Prabir is very strongly and adamant, and rightly so, that this is not at all the case. Don't make technology a kind of second-hand handmaiden of science. In fact, technology very often in the past and present comes first and enables later scientific knowledge of the laws of nature. So you invent the microscope, you invent the telescope, and then, of course, the computer and so on, and that opens up huge vistas. Or take it even simpler. Early man first found how to float something, how to create something that floats. Didn't understand the mechanism of why it floats, made it heavier, it still floated, heavier, and then it doesn't float. And then you understand the laws, and you're able to make ships and all of huge weight, but will float. So if you like, there is something of a alternating and feedback relationship with technology, advancing science, advancing technology, advancing science, advancing technology, and so on. Since technology is not the mere handmaiden of science, then we must give much greater respect to technology and its producers than we currently do. There tends to be a bias. Oh, scientific researchers are great and all that technology. Oh, okay, very wrong. As Prabir says, we must understand nature to make things, and we make things to understand nature. Technological change and development must operate within the confines of the laws of nature, but also has its own pathway involving the creation of practical designs based on experience, intuition, and sometimes even corrected through trial and error. So it has its own dynamic, even as they are connected. Science, scientific research, is universal, and its knowledge claims can diffuse and spread much more easily. Technology is more localized and national and does not spread that easily. And as Vijay pointed out, we have a whole history of which stronger countries try to prevent other countries from getting the kind of technology that can help them. The second dimension I want to take up. Science and technology operate within a matrix of deeply unequal social relations of power, wealth, status, and respect. And both the previous speakers have emphasized this very strongly in how it shapes. And it shapes, to greater or lesser extent, the very direction of scientific research and of technological pursuits. So, for example, how many scientists and how much money is spent for developing the military-industrial complex, when we still have a world of so many people starving and so on. We live today in an era of neoliberal capitalist globalization, and Prabir's book focuses particularly on this. We live today in the era of neoliberal capitalist globalization, where profit generation by privately owned corporations is greatly prioritized even by the state. This means there is great effort to privatize production and dissemination of certain kinds of both scientific research and technology designing, especially through intellectual property rights. This is something that gets a strong focus in Prabir's book. This business of intellectual property rights and the monopolies created have had very damaging effects in areas like health, pharmaceuticals. Talked about this here. Agriculture, industrialization in poor and developing countries, and in the IT sector, where open source collaborations can take place and be much more rewarding for ever wider section of the public. Prabir was in fact particularly focused on this, and he had that skill and ability which many of us don't have to understand how this could be done. Of course, there are those who say that, oh, but you must have IPRs because that would be the way to encourage and incentivize innovation. And here, the book points out that innovation can be incentivized and rewarded in ways other than intellectual property right monopolies. They can be incentivized and rewarded through license rights, through royalties, through state awards. If you like, summing up in a sense what Prabir says here is clearly breaking away from the neoliberal prioritization of corporate profit-making and moving in the direction of much greater democratization of the structures of political, economic, and social decision-making is necessary to advance the creation, expansion, and stabilization of a knowledge commons. A revolutionization in the advancement of knowledge and its benefits for humankind is also connected to a political revolutionization and radicalization, which can change all kinds of power relations. The third dimension that I want to talk about, and this is something that is sometimes referred to but often forgotten, and that's the importance of the scientific temper or outlook. This scientific temper is connected to a recognition of the distinctive character of the scientific method or approach. In classrooms, when I ask students, some of them even be science students, I say, tell me, is science a revolution in knowledge? Yes or no? And you'll be surprised how many students say yes, and it's the wrong answer. In fact, science is a revolution in ignorance, because the more and more you know, the more you realize how little you know. And because you realize how little you know, the effort to constantly provide better and deeper understanding continues. That's something that's absolutely scientific, central to the scientific pursuit. And the way it advances, and this is something Prabir emphasizes, is not in some incremental way in which you have it, but through what are called paradigm shifts in both science and technology. That is to say, it sometimes takes place in jerks. There's a scientific theory, Newton's, that explains so many things, but then there's certain anomaly that it doesn't explain. You don't reject it because it still explains a lot. And you still carry on with it until something comes up, which can actually dramatically increase your understanding. So the shift from Newton to Einstein. But that doesn't mean that Newton's there is still not relevant in so many ways and important in so many ways here. For example, the advances, for example, take place when a newer theoretical structure emerges, explaining something quite new, or explains everything that the older one did, but does it more elegantly, or explains everything that the old one did, plus something more. That's what's meant in terms of paradigm shift here. Now, I want to come to the question of belief and the distinctive nature of science. There are all kinds of beliefs, but a scientific one is a justified belief where the process of justifying is itself open and universal. So scientists of completely different cultural, religious backgrounds can all validate that scientific claim. So you can have in India high-level scientists who are fervent worshippers of some god, but when it comes to scientific advance, can still recognize that this scientific approach is better than the other ones, and this can help us here. So scientists can validate. We can talk about a scientific approach, and this is, I think, also important because I'm from the social sciences. We can also talk about a scientific approach in the study of the social sciences as well. Yes, social sciences and the natural sciences are different, but there is something called a scientific approach, even in the social sciences. And the three constitutive aspects of such an approach in the social sciences are: one, internal logic of the argumentation. Second, the principle of evidentiality. And third, very important, explanatory power. Beliefs that are faith-based, as in magic and religion, shape certain kinds of behavior. Within their context, these beliefs and behaviors are not irrational. What I mean by that is that we have all kinds of social needs, and religion, for example, serves certain social needs, for example, solace at the death of a loved one or so on, that others will not provide. So we have all kinds of social needs, and they have their own particular context. And if you understand the assumptions and all that, and you operate within that, it's quite rational. The classic example here is Peter Winch's point about the rain dance of tribes. The rain dance of tribal communities serves all kinds of purposes, bringing them together, connecting them as a group, sharing their concerns. But insofar, that's why they're called incommensurable. So you have different kinds of rationalities, which are rational within their own particular context of assumptions and the logic that comes from that. But insofar as these incommensurables actually share a common space, then they compete, then they clash, and you have to adjudicate. So, for example, the rain dance may be fine in its own framework and all that, but insofar as that rain dance is also about trying to bring about rain, it's going to be much inferior to science, which better explains why rain takes place. So when there is epistemological competition between these different incommensurable rationalities, then there has to be adjudication as to which approach explains and understands better and can help humans to overcome their problems. Scientific rationality is the enemy of strong relativism, whether epistemological or cultural. Today in the social sciences, there's so much preoccupation with cultural relativism of every kind. And you even have many people, I will not take names, who say that, why do you go on and on about science? Okay, that's fine, it's in your own area, but this is fine in others. No, science is distinctive. Because of its universal character, the universal character of science, with its provisional truths, which cut across all cultures, societies, races, religions, ethnicities, etc. And that's why you can learn from that. That's why across all societies, they want electricity, for example. We can learn from each other. There are better ways of doing things. And I emphasize this point about the distinctive rationality because Prabir has always been committed to people's science movements, the Delhi Science Forum, the question of rational movements, seeking to go among the people, for example, in Kerala, the KSSP and so on, to try to develop a more scientific temper and understanding, which can help people. And when, of course, they try to do this, when you try to move towards promoting a more science-based rationality, don't be surprised that this will be opposed by those, for example, in the social sciences who mystify history. I'm talking about the current dispensation and the problem of Hindutva and the acolytes of Hindutva. Please do not forget Davolkar, Pansare, and Kalburgi, who are all part of the rationalist popular science movement, and what happened to them in India. Prabir's concern for connecting science and technology to the good of the widest possible number of people, particularly for the oppressed and exploited majority, puts him in the club of all those, whether scientists, technologists, and many others with or without special sites of expertise, puts him in the club of all of these who are committed to a universal humanism. Science is universal, but you have to add the question of humanism to it. And that's why the question of power relations comes in, and the direction of science and technology towards the promotion of a universal humanism. That is to say, to developing the political, economic, social, and cultural structures that can create the conditions for human flourishing for all, irrespective of differences of class, caste, gender, race, nationality, and so on. Today, our enormous problems of mass poverty, rising inequalities of wealth and power, pandemics, authoritarian and racist populisms, democratic degeneration, environmental crises, possible nuclear devastation are all global in character. If science and technology are to help in tackling these, then how can we not seek to move in the direction of an ever wider and deeper construction of knowledge as commons? Thank you.
Achin, thank you so much. Sincere thanks to you. I'm sure we've all been deeply moved by your presentation, by the eloquence, coherence, and concise approach to trying to summarize in solidarity Prabir's latest book, which is, as he shares and you have shared, a bringing together of his life of experience and reflection. And I think it is profoundly important that you have shared in a way which provides a platform for our reflections and our discussions, the breadth and the depth, and as you say, the universal humanism, which is central to what Prabir has written and has been part of his life's work. Simply, we encourage you to try and read this book, this important book. It's vital in general, and it's vital for our times today, you know. And also, we have to clearly share that we've intended this webinar, this discussion, to be an act of solidarity, both with Prabir, but also with his thought and his ideas. So as part of that respect, let's say, and this solidarity, we're now, after thanking Vijay, Dorothy, and Achin for those really, really inspiring and powerful presentations, to open to the panelists, the participants, the attendees, and just to say thank you for you all for attending. We're been up to 80 from across the world who have participated in this. We have some questions already that in the question and answer facility that you have, and I will go through 2 of those at present, and then but also encourage participants, if you wish, there's no obligation, of course, to write any questions you have in the question and answer facility here. Okay, if we could begin with one question from Biju, and he simply said, Vijay talked about communication as one of the 2 areas still controlled by the global north. What is your comment? And I think that your is to everybody, about Al Jazeera, which has successfully established an alternative narrative that contests with the imperial narrative. We can have a discussion which doesn't, I'd encourage us not to just focus on Al Jazeera, but look at ways of engaging in spreading views and ideas from people from across the world from different ways, and also through the communication mechanisms. Vijay, as it was directed to you first, would you mind sharing any thoughts you have, please, on that question?
Well, I mean, you know, these issues of control and slippage of control are not as straightforward. So Al Jazeera's emergence during the illegal US war in Iraq was fiercely contested by the United States. When you enter Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, Qatar, there's 2 buildings. There's the English and the Arabic. When you enter the Arabic building, what you see right in front of you is the clothes of Tariq Yaqub, who was killed by a US Abrams tank while he was reporting from the Palestine Hotel. This attack on Al Jazeera journalists continues even now. I mean, you know, entire families of Al Jazeera journalists targeted by the Israelis. So the contest over communication is quite fierce. The US State Department recently released a report about so-called Russian disinformation in Latin America. And they named 3 outlets. One was RT, used to be Russia Today. but then El Ciudadano, which is a Chilean-based newspaper, and then Presenza. They argued that these are, purveyors of Russian disinformation. The crackdown on NewsClick is precisely part of this quote unquote, battle to maintain a certain kind of control over communication. In fact, if you look at the comments around NewsClick, the word used by the government is information war. That's the phrase that they are using, that there's an information war, and the accusation is NewsClick or El Ciudadano or Presenza, and so on, are involved in an information war. They are extremely touchy about this, which actually demonstrates the attempt to maintain a certain kind of dominance over the quote unquote narrative. This word narrative is used a lot these days. It's a substitute, in a way, Achin, it's like the relativism of storytelling. There are different narratives. There is no truth. There's just many different narratives. It's a different kind of relativism. And the pursuit of, let's say, the truth is set aside there. And so there is this anxiety. So Al Jazeera has made a foray into this sphere. So has RT or other, NewsClick in a much smaller scale. I must say, in a much smaller scale. And yet, the very presence in the attempt to tell the truth of people's lives, let's say the farmers' movement and so on, the attempt to tell the truth itself is taken as a great, it's seen as a great risk, to the powers that be, and they shut it down. We are seeing this with a kind of intensity in Europe that's unbelievable. I was quite struck by the fact that Paul Mason, a British journalist who now seems to want to run against Jeremy Corbyn in Islington, Paul Mason was meeting with British intelligence to basically talk about people, including myself, saying that, we are a threat to democracy. Why? Because I don't agree with Paul Mason on his understanding of the world. That use of state power to shut down, different kinds of communication is key here. And in the case of Al Jazeera, it's not shut it down legally, but in fact, with great and extreme violence, from Tariq Yaqub all the way down to Daoud and his family in Gaza right now.
Yes, I think that's Achin and Dottie. Would you like to add to reflections on that question? And as Vijay has taken us from, how should we put it, the international through Al Jazeera to the regional, but also to the national. There are so many different areas here. But as with NewsClick and many other institutions and groups like that, the national area is very much one which is the subject of contestation at present. Achin first, maybe.
This is an area of Vijay's expertise and knowledge, not really so much of mine. But what does worry me, and I just have this, is that insofar as the mobile phone has also become a source of getting knowledge and information here, the ability of governments now to carry out unknown surveillance on the public is now so great,
So big.
and the temptation is so strong that even if we get the kind of government we want, I'm not sure that that government, which will have its enemies, will not still want to have that kind of a situation, which is unjustified in terms of privacy and so on. Yeah.
Yes.
And therefore, there's a larger question of what are the regulations and mechanisms of watching over guardianship, whatever that can do that. Maybe there's something to learn from Europe, which has been a bit better than other parts. I don't know, but this is a very, very serious problem. Prabir, in fact, would be able to talk with great authority.
Absolutely, and does. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I think I would also like to discuss how, because I saw also there's a question about Palestine. Um, Unfortunately, Vijay mentioned that during what Sabir, described as the five controls. But then that time when Samir was writing about it, we're still in the era of neoliberal capitalism. But now we have left that. We are now in the era of monopoly capitalism, wherein there is extreme power among just a few corporations that controls energy, that controls food, that controls information and data. And I think that control of information and data is very, very scary and very, very dangerous, because that also controls how people would think. What is reality? What is preferable? What system? And that hinders as well chances for even addressing and changing the rules of the game. The information it is used as well to suppress not just news like Al Jazeera, but also even how the expression of dissent is being shared as well. Like in London, since the last 6 months, the last 5 months, there had been protests in support of the Palestinians. And every time, even no matter if it's 500,000, no matter if it's 400,000, the report is always 100,000 people are protesting in London. So even the control of what will be presented in the news. And then there is also the question of how the Public Order Act is being used to just clamp down on dissent. And this range from not just Palestine but also climate protests. We are very much aware that there are new laws just to prohibit people also from walking slowly on the street, because it reminded me of China when the Chinese protesters tried to walk around instead of protesting because they will be arrested. In the center of London, in the height of this oldest democracy, so-called, you also have that law that prohibit people from walking slowly, or from also preventing MPs from attending well, there was an attempt that will prohibit MPs from attending protests in support of Palestine. There's also all those new rules, new part of the Public Order Act that expanded the power of the police to stop and search, to new orders that ban people from participating in associations, in actions, activities, or controlling those associations, movement activities. There are also new offenses. So in the list that criminalizes certain kinds of protests altogether. So these are all addressing the new innovative way of protesting, and these are directed against Extinction Rebellion, against Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, or other forms of protest that are being done by the climate movement. So I think this is also to say that especially now in the North, this information is being suppressed. And one fear shared by the Europeans is that the election that will also happen this year might come up with many governments in the EU that is more far right, not just conservative, but far right. And we needed really to consolidate also our power as social movements, as campaign organizations, as progressive think tanks, how to address this, because we will be in a new territory that after all these elections and the governments are veering towards the right, there are all these threats that Europe may not also be the same as we used to know it.
Thank you, Dottie, as well. So yes, it's the core reflection is that each of us can talk about the national experience, where in the UK, not only is Dottie is saying it's you can be prosecuted or at least arrested or detained temporarily in a harassed way for walking too slowly or cycling collectively, or even, believe it or not, shouting too loud. We've had as well. Anyway, the issue is that in each of our countries and our regions, this hollowing out of democracy and the rights of expression is happening consistently and in a horribly structured way. Just like to highlight that the Asia-Europe People's Forum, its privilege of working and collaborating with social movements across Asia and Europe, has tried to talk about these challenges in each country, and also how people have responded, how social movements have responded, and hence the whole events with parliamentarians on the right to dissent, as a concept, and how people in different countries are trying to enable in law that possibility of dissent. It sounds a paradox these days, but it is. These forms of response are empowering. We can all list the challenges, but it's about sharing our responses and how we're working to this. One of the responses has historically been to set up independent news media. Yeah, and NewsClick was an example of that, is an example of that, as has been other examples across the world. So I think as social movements and groups committed to this change, we have to keep that audit going and keep that lifeblood of a variety of views, so-called dissenting views, but also human views, to be kept alive. We have more questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to link together for the participants and see how you respond, because there is a bit of a commonality around them. The first one is from Samir Dosani. Is it possible to comment on the use of science technology by the resistant forces in Palestine? It has been impressive to see them fighting off what everyone assumed was to be an unstoppable Israeli machine with technology that has sometimes been appropriated from the Israelis. Any thoughts there from Vijay or anyone else? And also we have a question which is on nearly the same vein. Knowledge as commons sounds good. This is from Gulzar Ahmad. Knowledge as commons sounds good. Knowledge is said as power, while it has created a chaos in the present day world, because it lacks humanity and compassion today, as an example of the ruthless violence going on in Gaza, Palestine, Ukraine-Russia war, Haiti, Kashmir, freedom movement, etc. And the simple retort from Gulzar is, what do you say? So we've got two broad questions there, which focus on the overall knowledge as commons approach, and also, as in your introduction, Vijay, about the issue and role and control and the use and abuse of science and technology. Vijay, maybe if you could answer first, and we can actually take these as a reflective answers, and then we'll come to a summing up, because we're heading towards the end of our time. So don't be shy in how you bring things together here. You can treat it as a bit of your, your bringing together of your thoughts, anything you wanted to say and haven't quite been able to say it, under the umbrella of these two questions. Thank you very much.
Andy, I'll take advantage of this moment.
We're generous. We're generous here.
Yeah. No, to say that, I've always been really happy that I was introduced to Marxism and became a Marxist, because it allowed me to understand that the world has not a straight line of movement, but things are shaped by contradictions. And one has to look for contradictions in the world. And as Engels said, things don't happen in a straight line, but in zigs and zags. So, I just want to say that people should read Probir's memoir, Keeping Up the Good Fight, because talk about zigs and zags. He was arrested during the emergency in the 1970s, went to prison then, and is in prison now. It's a terrific story. One Indian story of the zigs and zags of Indian history, as it were, and the struggles. Generally, I don't like to think about ingenuity in terms of weaponry in general. I generally don't like to use the word ingenuity with weapons, because weapons are merely a form of waste and human destruction. But also the contradictions, right? It's of course true that there was a great ingenuity from what we know of what happened on the 7th of October, the incendiary balloons and so on. There was a great deal of the contradictions playing on the side of the Palestinians for a few hours. And I think that's important, for a few hours, because the absolute invariance, the absolute disparity of power and technology is breathless. I mean, the fact that the Israelis have this immense military force and are able to use this military force without care of any international law, including bombing the Iranian embassy in Damascus in violation of the Vienna Convention, absolute brazen act of violation of law. It's true that contradictions enable even those in the worst conditions to find ways to defend themselves, even in the very poorest and wretched conditions. After all, if one goes and looks at the history of guerrilla warfare, look at the story of the great Atlas Mountains, Abdul Karim Krim, one of the great modern guerrilla fighters in northern Morocco, from whom Che Guevara, I see Che Guevara behind Achin's shoulder, from whom Che Guevara learned his lessons of guerrilla warfare. Abdul Karim Krim and his confederates developed the technology of guerrilla warfare with nothing, with what I guess we would call chewing gum and sticky tape. But they came up with technologies of warfare using, their advantages, their understanding of the terrain, and so on. There are always forms of knowledge that people have at their fingertips, not only knowledge of terrain, but an understanding of the material conditions or the material possibilities of where you are, different forms of warfare developed by people to defend themselves using different kinds of technologies. So that's true. But again, I don't want to use warfare as an example of human ingenuity. Far more important is how people are able to survive using ingenuity and technologies of different kinds. How people are able to survive. I mean, I remember reporting the war in Iraq and seeing how neighborhoods began to organize themselves as electricity grids were knocked out by the United States in that very brutal and illegal war. People developed their own capacities. And by the way, technology is a form of using tools of different kinds, including social relations. People developed a way of sharing what they had. They developed a way of building, water sharing, which I found very interesting, how they would collect whatever rainwater was possible, harvest that, and share it among various flats in a building. Very, very impressive forms of ingenuity to survive. Humans have a great capacity to survive. And even though there are small forces of power, minorities that want to dominate us, that want to put forward irrationality as the order of the day, humans have the capacity to rise up and fight back, even when things seem impossible. And there's the contradictions. Even though it seems in our societies now that we are on the back foot, as Dottie said, maybe the right will triumph, but it only triumphs for a while. It doesn't triumph eternally because of those contradictions.
Yes.
They can't settle our problems. Only we can, and we will.
Excellent. Thank you, Vijay, very much indeed. Dottie, would you like to share any thoughts? Please.
Yeah. Well, I was also thinking of looking at contradictions as well. It is also a contradiction that if we look at during the colonial periods, knowledge was used by the progressive forces, by the revolutionary movement to organize and also to emancipate. So it is part of knowledge to be emancipatory. That if we use knowledge and share information, then we gain power and we gain freedom. So it is not surprising that it is being used now against for progressive forces against the forces of dissent, because keeping information unavailable, keeping the information to the few is always the instrument of the rich, the instrument of the elite, the instrument of the powerful, to keep people from organizing and challenging the domination of a few. So I think in this kind of knowing knowledge, it is also important to know our history of struggles, our history of social movement building, and to link all those knowledge, because many times even what is seen now as new forms of dissent are not actually new. It was used before against tyrants, it was used before against dictators, it was used before against colonialism. So we activists nowadays, I often remind when I have the chance to speak to the youth movement, that we are all actually standing on the shoulders of giants. That the forms of dissent, the knowledge of dissent, the history of dissent is there for us to use. So we have to be reminded, we need to be reminded, we need to know the history of emancipation, the history of fighting as well. And not think that we need to reinvent the wheel at this moment, because those knowledge, if applied at particular time, will always be our powerful tool. So I think I have to emphasize that. Lastly, going back to Europe as well, it has been quite a while since the European Social Forum was held here. That was 2010, and then it's sort of like because of a difficulty of finding a host, then it's slowly getting forgotten. It was revived in Firenze 2 years ago when the Europeans wanted to think we need that space. So I also wanted to invite everyone that coming end of April 26 to 28, there will be a European common space for alternatives. We are facing two existential crises: the threat of war and the threat of climate breakdown. And we need a space where we come up also in Europe, and also to think about how can we decolonize the knowledge, how do we decolonize truths that are known here in Europe and used to kill the memories of colonization as well. How do we decolonize knowledge and come together? So I think some of the sessions will be online. I will put on the chat. For those based in Europe who can attend, you're most welcome to attend this. So I also use this opportunity to invite people for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Well, I'll also use the opportunity to just reaffirm to people who are not all aware that the Asia-Europe People's Forum, which has been in existence since 1996, prides itself on being an umbrella for exchange, for reflection, for collaboration, and for solidarity amongst social movements and groups across Asia and Europe, but as we can see from Vijay's presence, not exclusively whatsoever. And we warmly welcome people to be part of Asia-Europe People's Forum's activities as they come up. Achin, please.
Right. There was a question about Palestine and knowledge as commons. But knowledge as commons means that we want to make knowledge as widely available to as many people as possible. That's what's central to the idea. There's a difference between the natural order and the human social order. The similarity is that both have patterns and regularities. And the natural scientist seeks to understand the patterns and regularities of the natural world. But you also have the effort through Marxism and elsewhere to understand the patterns and regularities of human societies. in which there is uneven distribution of power, and of course, all sorts of things. In the natural world, you understand it, and then depending upon your moral and political character, you seek to use that knowledge to do something better. In the case of the social sciences, the knowledge that you get can change your behavior and that society in a much quicker and closer way, because we behave on the basis of what we understand and our knowledge. And that, for example, in the feminist movement, when you began to question the existing knowledge and understanding and values and you change it, that brings about a kind of change that is very, very important and dramatic. And of course, that's much quicker. The laws of nature don't change in that sense. Now, how is this connected to the question of Palestine? I agree with Vijay that don't talk about science and technology in the domain of weapons and how you're going to fight to defeat Israel. That's not on. But there are sources and mechanisms of spreading knowledge that can help the Palestinian cause to a great extent. And that has actually come from the spread of knowledge in many parts of the world of the injustices that have been done. And the kind of feedback and the kind of information that is provided about the great injustice and the immorality can spread and has spread, ironically enough, despite the control, even in Western democracies, over the whole Israel-Palestine issue, has spread through different sources, the mobile, the internet, and so on. And that has created a kind of support in civil society that is very, very important for the Palestinian cause. And here I just want to end by saying something about political conflict. And that would also, I think, situate this question of technology and science in a certain way also. And that is that political conflict is not above all a contest of arms or economic strength. It is a contest of wills in which one side seeks to impose its will on the other. And its arms and its economics and its other mechanism, technology, are means by which it seeks to do this. But what happens if that will to resist is so wide and so deep that it cannot succeed in imposing its will on that? That creates the basis for why you can fight back and even win. That's why the most powerful countries in the world, militarily and so on, have lost battles against others here. And therefore, there is that emotional dimension of injustice and all connected to knowledge and others. And that's emotional is important because we are moral beings. We have a sense of justice and injustice. And insofar as knowledge can connect to generating a sense of justice and a righteous anger and all that, it can strengthen, of course, the basis on which you can fight. And the problem for Israel is that there's no way that they are going to ever be able to defeat or destroy that will and determination to resist, not just by the Palestinians, but hopefully by more and more people everywhere. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely, and sentiments I know we all agree with strongly from our hearts and our heads. So we are coming to the end, but I've just been seeing that we have two hands. People haven't put their questions in the chat, the question area, but Naseem Malik and Rajiv Chowdhury. Naseem, if you have a question, would it be possible to share it in the chat, or would you want to ask it now? Can you speak? Can you speak at all? Because we haven't been able to read your question. So, Naseem, please. If you could be brief, please. It's a question, not a comment. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, Naseem. For a question, yes, please, not a comment.
I'm thankful to all that I have listened. We have gathered a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge and technology, media we are talking about, at the same time we were talking that what it has given us. Now, I'm a Scandinavian. I've lived in 50 years in Sweden now, and never thought about the fear. And this technology has given such fear that we are heading towards the World War III. And in the schools, they are just teaching their children, how to live in a situation when there will be war. We have to ration the food. We have to do this, This technology has given us the fear. This is what we are living in, with the children are asking us,
Yes.
So we are talking about a lot in environments, everything. But all these bombings in Gaza, what the First World War, the atom bomb, more than that, we have damaged in Gaza and then in Ukraine, So where we are heading to, just fear, fear, fear.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that comment, Nasim. We also have a comment from, I think, hopefully a question from Rajiv Chowdhury. Rajiv, I can't see you've written your question down, but would you like to share your question, please, if possible? Rajiv, can you join or not? Okay, we'll wait for a little bit, but then. Okay, well, thanks for your wish. If you have a question, please write it in the question box, because sometimes the connections are a challenge. Okay, and then lastly, right at the end, our dear friend Tina has put a big question into the question box, which I will share, but also assume that the answer will not be possible in a few seconds. Tina asks, a multipolar world has emerged by the rise of the BRICS and the rise of China and India and their greater cooperation. Discuss in brackets from me. Kindly summarize the benefits for the global South, especially on the issue of knowledge as an issue, of knowledge as commons. Okay. Does anyone like to pick that up at all? I think it's looking the effects of the rise of the not the multipolar world and the influence on communication and knowledge.
I'll just say very quickly.
Yeah.
As one thinks that there's going to be a multipolar world, it means that there are going to be certain rising elites.
Yes.
And the extent to which knowledge is going to spread commons will also depend upon the behavior of those elites in relation to knowledge.
Okay. Yes, that's very clear. Vijay or Dottie, would you like to add anything to that very correct comment from Achin?
Well, the thing is that I prefer to think of us in a period of churning than something as settled as multipolarity or a multipolar world. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think uncertainty breeds its own dangers because it creates, a lot of fear and a lot of, like attempt by the older powers to hold on to things. And I think we are in that place more. People are feeling, both a new mood in the South, but also defensiveness. I mean, I just want to say it's pretty extraordinary that South Africa, Namibia, Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua are standing up against the old colonial powers on the question of Israel. It's pretty amazing that, countries that used to feel the IMF squeeze. I've just finished a book on Cuba. And in that book, I wrote this book with Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky and I found in the archive, in the US archive, repeatedly US government officials talk about the Cubans as being disobedient and being, I mean, this is a word they use, that they are disobedient, or that their disobedience is a bad example. This is their language. It's not something we're making up. And it's this, the fact that so many countries now feel the ability to be disobedient, to stand up and say to the Germans, as the Namibians have said, that you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to genocide. I don't know if we're in a multipolar situation, but I do know that the old order is really no longer operating. And that produces its own sense of despair, uncertainty, which is quite why, there is a sense of impending global war and fear about that, And so for the issue of knowledge as commons, I think it's really important for people to speak with clarity about what's happening these days, to speak without obfuscation, not to exaggerate things, to build the theory from the facts, not to impose a theory like multipolarity on the world. Build the theory from the facts. By the way, that used to be the method of Marxism. Build the theory from the facts. Don't impose theories on the world that make no sense at all. See the actual motion of history. And seems to me that we need much more clarity in this time. And it's precisely clarity that many people don't want to hear about. They want mystification to be what determines how people see the world, not an attempt at having clarity.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Dottie, do you have any last word? And then I will conclude, I'm afraid.
Okay,
Yeah.
just very, very quick on, we have seen that on the question of the COVID vaccine, we have seen that in South Africa, through the cooperation of India and South Africa, there was the establishment of the WHO-sponsored mRNA vaccination hub at Achin. And this is establishing mRNA technology and setting up technology transfer to other African countries. Also on the question of on climate, I can't remember anymore. I've lost track of how many times whenever I'm at COP, the media will always ask me sort of like they wanted to ride on well, look at how China or how India prevented the discussion on fossil fuels. And the question is, it is now easy to see how they still try to demonize the BRICS country, but then at the same time, the actions of the new emerging powers speak for or sort of like showing or inspiring other countries to see that it's no longer the US that dominates the story, that there are alternative truths. There are also roles for emerging economies, for leadership also. We have seen during the height of the vaccine, while the North is hoarding vaccines, Russia and China made vaccines available to many countries in the South. And that, in a way, is a soft power, building soft power also for those emerging economies.
Yeah.
Of course, it's another game now that with mRNA being seen as the more powerful vaccine for anti-COVID. That's why it is important that the Afrigen is running and trying to reverse engineer COVID vaccine. Otherwise, you'll have the continuing monopoly of the big pharma.
Okay, Dottie, did you want to have a last word, Achin, or I'm going to read some quotes from Prabir? Yeah.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, and just to say thank you. There's been a flurry of enthusiasm in the question and answer at the very end. I will read them out, but I'm afraid these questions will have to go to people's own digestive thoughts. First of all, this is to Andy. My question is, why is Israel doing the same thing that they were subjected to? A very pertinent question from Rajiv Chowdhury. And also a very pertinent question from Nalini Rathnaraj, which is, we should discuss about how these resources, science and technology and communications are less accessible for women and girls and controlled by patriarchy. Absolutely, Nalini, absolutely. Okay, and this, I just have to do the, these questions including the issues around the multipolar world, and thank you, Tina, for raising that, have been at the heart of so many of the debates and discussions of the Asia-Europe People's Forum over the recent years and even decades. And we hope that they will be part of those in the moving forward. Time is up, I'm afraid. I will like to share my deep thanks to over 80 people who have attended, been participating in this very important and timely webinar. Thank you all for your time and interest. I'd like to thank the organizers, the technical organizers of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, greatly appreciated. I'd like to thank our three brilliant and excellent and inspiring speakers, Vijay, Prashad, Achin, Vanaik, and also Dorothy Guerrero. But I think I'd like to finish, with your permission, on reading two quotes from Prabir. I think actually it's a comprehensive answer to some of our questions. The first is really in the current context that he is living, and he says, and I share this is taken not just from the book but also from a summary of the book by another news agency in India, and this is: the current dispensation believes that the facade of freedom combined with control over media, including social media, is enough. Yes, it may be possible to do this for a short time, maybe in a few states, often by creating warlike conditions with a neighbor, and throughout appealing to people to close ranks behind the great leader. But not for long, as Achin has been sharing with us, but not for long and not across the country. As Shelley's immortal line says, we are many and they are few. And I'll finish with the last quote from Prabir from his book. Victimhood robs us of participation in the creation of history. It reduces us to mere objects of history. Instead, I would like to assume the vantage point of people as makers of history. Yes, the government of the day wields powers that seem to overwhelm individuals and organizations. But it is people and their actions that finally determine history, not as we please and when we please, but in ways that neither the people nor their rulers anticipate. And I hope you will treat that as a summary of our solidarity for Prabir, and also a further encouragement to you all to read his latest book, Knowledge as Commons, please. Okay, and with that, thanks to you all for your participation, to the speakers again, and to the Asia Europe People's Forum for this organization. And I bring this webinar to a close. Thank you.